If you've ever inherited a family property, you probably expected old furniture, dusty photo albums, maybe a few forgotten memories tucked away in a closet. But what would you think if the very first thing you noticed was that every single window had been nailed shut from the inside? Not one window, not a couple of windows, every window. And what if the person who sealed them shut was the one person you trusted more than anyone else in the world? My grandmother. For years, I believed those boards were just another one of her odd habits, something older folks do without ever explaining why. I was wrong, because what I eventually discovered inside that cabin revealed a secret my grandmother had protected for nearly 40 years. A secret powerful enough to change everything I thought I knew about my family. Now, before we go any further, let me tell you something. This isn't a ghost story. Nobody heard voices in the woods, nobody saw shadows in the dark. And yet, what happened in those Wisconsin woods was far more unsettling than anything people tell around a campfire. Because this story is about a promise, a disappearance, and a love that refused to die even after decades had passed. My name is Ethan Walker, and this happened in northern Wisconsin back in 2008. I was 18 years old, fresh out of high school, flat broke, no college plans, no savings account worth talking about. Just an old pickup truck, a part-time grocery store job, and absolutely no clue what my future looked like. The one person who always believed I'd figure things out was my grandmother, Margaret Walker. Everybody called her Maggie. She wasn't the kind of grandma who spent her afternoons baking cookies and watching television. Maggie was old school, tough as nails. The kind of woman who could split a stack of firewood before most people finished their morning coffee. She lived alone in a small cabin deep in the pine woods about 30 miles outside town. And ever since I was a kid, that place felt different. Not scary, just different. No television, no internet, no nearby neighbors. Nothing but trees, silence, and the sound of wind moving through the forest. As a boy, I loved spending weekends there. But looking back now, there was one thing that always stood out. Every evening, right before sunset, Grandma would make the same walk through the cabin, without fail. She'd stop at each window, look at it carefully, then move to the next one. At the time, I figured it was just part of her routine. People her age have habits, that's normal. But years later, I realized she wasn't checking the windows. She was making sure they stayed exactly where she wanted them. Closed.
3 weeks after my 18th birthday, Grandma passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small, just family, a few old friends, and a lot of memories. I remember standing beside her grave, feeling completely lost. Not because of the cabin, not because of money, because for the first time in my life, I couldn't pick up the phone and hear her voice. I kept expecting her to call and remind me to change the oil in my truck, or tell me I was working too hard for too little pay. But the phone never rang, and the silence that followed felt heavier than I ever imagined. A few days later, the family gathered at a lawyer's office. I wasn't expecting anything, maybe an old watch, a family photograph, something sentimental. Instead, the lawyer slid a folder across the desk. Inside was the deed to Grandma's cabin. She had left the entire property to me. For a moment, I honestly thought there had been a mistake. The cabin wasn't some tiny shed in the woods. The land alone was worth more money than I'd ever had in my life. Then something happened that I didn't understand at the time. Across the room, my Uncle Richard lowered his eyes. Not angry, not jealous, not surprised, just concerned. When the meeting ended, he walked beside me into the parking lot. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. Then he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Ethan," he said quietly, "if you decide to keep the cabin, don't stay there alone." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Richard looked toward the distant tree line, as if he were remembering something he'd spent years trying to forget. Then he shook his head. "Just promise me you'll be careful." That was it. No explanation, no details, just a warning. At the time, I figured grief was affecting him. People handle loss differently. I didn't think much about it. A week later, I loaded up my truck and headed for the cabin. The road looked exactly the way I remembered. The same winding path, the same endless pine trees, the same silence. But the moment I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, I knew something wasn't right. The cabin felt darker than it should have, much darker. At first, I couldn't figure out why. Then I looked around, and my stomach tightened. Every single window had been covered with wooden boards. Every one of them. From the inside. Some of the nails were rusted with age. Others had nearly disappeared into the wood. Whoever sealed those windows hadn't done it recently. They'd been that way for decades. I slowly walked from room to room, counting them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Every window. No exceptions. And standing there in the fading afternoon light, I suddenly remembered Richard's warning. If you decide to keep the cabin, don't stay there alone. For the first time, I found myself wondering whether my uncle had been trying to protect me from something, or prepare me for it. Because hidden somewhere inside that cabin was a secret my grandmother had guarded for almost 40 years. And I was about to become the first person to uncover it. Before I tell you what I found in Grandma Maggie's bedroom, let me ask you something. Have you ever discovered something so small that it completely changed the way you saw someone you loved? Because that's exactly what happened to me. The day before, I'd been focused on the windows, the boards, the nails, the questions. But by the following afternoon, those windows weren't the mystery anymore. Grandma was. And the deeper I looked into her life, the more I realized there was an entire chapter of her story that nobody in our family had ever talked about. Not once. The next morning, I woke up on the old couch in the cabin. The place felt different in daylight. Still quiet, still familiar. But now it felt like the cabin was holding its breath, as if it had been waiting years for someone to start asking questions. I decided to begin with the windows. I grabbed a hammer from the shed and returned to the living room.
The nearest window was covered by weathered boards that looked older than I was. I pulled the first nail, then another, then another. The wood finally loosened with a groan. When I removed the board and pushed the window open, fresh air rushed into the room. For the first time, sunlight spilled across the floorboards. And that's when I noticed something strange. The outer frame was covered with marks, long scratches, dozens of them, not random, not natural. The lines ran in patterns across the wood, almost like someone had repeatedly dragged something against the frame. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it, but nothing about it felt familiar. After a moment, I stepped back. Maybe it was weather damage. Maybe years of wind and debris had caused it. Still, the sight stayed with me. Something about those marks bothered me, and I couldn't explain why. The rest of the day was spent cleaning. Dust covered nearly every surface. Old books lined the shelves. Boxes sat untouched in corners. The cabin felt less like a house and more like a time capsule. Every room held another piece of Grandma's life. A life I suddenly realized I knew far less about than I thought. Late that afternoon, I walked into her bedroom. The moment I stepped inside, I stopped. Nothing had changed. The quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Her reading glasses rested on the nightstand. A paperback novel lay open exactly where she'd left it. For a second, it felt like she might walk through the door at any moment and tell me to quit snooping through her things. I smiled. Then the smile faded, because something caught my eye. A corner of the rug near the bed wasn't lying flat. It was raised slightly, just enough to look out of place. I crouched down and pulled the rug aside. Underneath was a loose floorboard. My heartbeat instantly picked up. Slowly, I slid my fingers underneath and lifted it. There was a small metal box hidden beneath the floor. Dust covered the lid. The lock had rusted away years ago. I stared at it for several seconds. Grandma had hidden this. The question was why? Carefully, I opened it. Inside were old photographs, dozens of them, black and white pictures, faded by time. Some showed logging crews standing beside massive timber trucks. Others showed local families gathered at picnics and county fairs. Most of the faces meant nothing to me, until I found one photograph that made me stop cold. A young woman stood beside a man I'd never seen before. They were smiling. His arm rested gently on her shoulder. For a moment, I didn't even recognize her. Then I looked closer. It was Grandma, 40 years younger, happier than I'd ever seen her, almost glowing. I turned the photograph over. Written on the back were 4 simple words. Summer of 1969. And beneath that, Maggie and Thomas. I stared at the name. Thomas. My grandmother had never mentioned a Thomas, not once. My mother never mentioned him. Richard never mentioned him. Nobody had. Yet judging by that photograph, he wasn't some casual friend. The way they looked at each other made that obvious. Who was he? And why had his name disappeared from our family's history? Then I noticed something folded beneath the photographs. A piece of paper, yellow with age. The handwriting was unmistakable. Grandma's. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The message contained only 6 words. If you find this, don't trust Richard. I froze. For several seconds I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even blink. The words felt impossible. Richard? The same uncle who warned me about the cabin? The same uncle who'd always shown up at family holidays? The same man Grandma trusted enough to keep helping her all these years? Nothing about it made sense, and somehow that made it even worse. I searched through the box again, looking for an explanation, a letter, a diary, anything. But there was nothing else, only photographs, the mysterious man named Thomas, and a warning written by my grandmother herself. That night, sleep never really came. Every time I closed my eyes, the same questions returned. Who was Thomas? Why had Grandma hidden his photograph? Why did nobody ever talk about him? And why would she leave behind a warning about Richard? By sunrise, I knew one thing for certain. The answers weren't inside town records. They weren't inside family photo albums, and they weren't inside that metal box. The truth was somewhere out in those woods, closer than I realized, waiting patiently beneath the trees, for someone willing to uncover it. Before we keep going, imagine finding a name that nobody in your family will talk about, a name that appears in hidden photographs, a name connected to warnings, secrets, and a cabin full of unanswered questions. Most people would probably let it go, tell themselves the past belongs in the past. But by this point, I was too far in. The windows, the photographs, the note, none of it felt accidental. And deep down, I knew Grandma Maggie had left those clues for a reason. I just didn't know what that reason was yet. The next morning, I spread everything across the kitchen table. The photographs, the metal box, the note. I studied each item again, hoping I'd missed something. At first, I found nothing. Then I noticed a dark smudge in the corner of one photograph. It looked like dirt, but when I gently wiped it clean, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't dirt. It was part of a drawing. A tiny, hand-drawn map. I immediately grabbed a magnifying glass from one of Grandma's drawers. The more I looked, the clearer it became. The cabin, a narrow creek, a large oak tree, and beside the tree, a small hand-drawn X. Below it were two initials, T.M., Thomas Miller. For the first time, I had more than a name. I had a destination. That afternoon, I grabbed a shovel, a compass, a bottle of water, and the photograph. Then I headed into the woods behind the cabin. The farther I walked, the quieter everything became. No traffic, no voices, no distant machinery. Only the sound of wind moving through the pines. The same sound Grandma had listened to for decades. 20 minutes later, I found the creek. My pulse quickened. The map was accurate. I followed the water line, scanning every tree I passed. One oak, then another, then another. Nothing. An hour went by. Sweat soaked through my shirt. Frustration started creeping in. Maybe I had misunderstood the map. Maybe I was chasing a dead end. Then I saw it. An enormous oak standing alone on a small rise overlooking the creek. The moment I got closer, I noticed something carved into the bark. 2 letters. T.M. My stomach tightened. The carving was old, very old. The tree had spent decades growing around those initials. Thomas had been here. Or someone connected to him had. I set down the shovel and started digging. At first, it felt ridiculous, like something out of an old movie. But 10 minutes later, the shovel struck something solid. Thunk. I froze. Then I dropped to my knees and cleared away the dirt with my hands. A metal container slowly emerged from the ground, weathered, heavy, hidden for decades. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were old newspapers, several bundles of letters, and a worn leather journal. I opened the cover. Written inside was a name. Thomas Miller. For a moment, I just stared. This wasn't a rumor anymore. This wasn't a family story. This was real. I sat beneath the oak tree and started reading. The first pages seemed ordinary. Fishing trips, work at the lumber mill, local town events, the kind of things anyone might write down. Then the tone changed. The entries became shorter, more anxious. Thomas wrote about being watched, about people asking questions, about discovering information he wasn't supposed to know. Again and again, one theme kept appearing. Fear. Not fear for himself, fear for someone else. Then I reached a sentence that made my chest tighten. If anything happens to me, Maggie knows the truth. I read it twice, then a third time. Grandma knew the truth. Whatever this was, she had been part of it from the beginning. I continued reading page after page, and then another familiar name appeared. Richard. My uncle. At first I thought I was reading it wrong. Back then, Richard would have only been a teenager, yet Thomas mentioned him repeatedly. Important conversations, important meetings, important decisions. Richard wasn't just a witness, he was somehow involved. That made absolutely no sense. Then I reached the final journal entry, the last words Thomas ever wrote. The date was October 14th, 1970. I remember the exact moment because the woods suddenly felt colder. The entry wasn't long, just a single paragraph. If you're reading this, they've probably convinced everyone I disappeared, but I didn't leave willingly. Someone else made that decision for me. That was it. No explanation, no names, no ending. The journal simply stopped, like the story had been cut in half. I stared at the page for several minutes. Thomas believed something was about to happen to him, and whatever happened, it happened shortly after he wrote those words. I packed everything back into the container and headed into town. At that point, I didn't need guesses. I needed someone who had actually lived through those years. There was only one person I could think of: Harold Bennett, an 82-year-old retired logger who had known Grandma Maggie since they were teenagers. When I arrived, Harold was sitting on his front porch drinking coffee. The old man greeted me with a smile. But the second I mentioned Thomas Miller, the smile disappeared. His face went pale. For several seconds, he didn't say a word. Then he slowly set down his coffee mug. "Ethan," he said quietly, "where did you hear that name?" I showed him everything: the photograph, the journal, the map, the hidden box. Harold looked through each item carefully. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and stared toward the distant woods. The silence stretched between us, long enough to make me uncomfortable. Finally, he sighed. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. Then he looked directly at me. "Ethan, Thomas Miller never disappeared." My heart started pounding. "What do you mean?" Harold swallowed hard. "Everyone was told he left town." He paused, then slowly shook his head. "But nobody ever saw him leave." A chill ran through me. I had spent days chasing answers. Now I had more questions than ever. Then Harold revealed one final detail. One detail that changed everything I thought I knew. The last person ever seen with Thomas Miller was your Uncle Richard. Before I tell you what Uncle Richard finally revealed, think about this for a moment. Have you ever spent years believing one version of a family story, only to discover the truth was something completely different? Because that's where I found myself. For days, every clue had pointed toward Richard. Grandma's warning, Thomas's journal, Harold's story. Everything seemed to lead back to one man. But family secrets are rarely that simple. Sometimes the person who looks guilty is the one carrying the heaviest burden. And what Richard told me that day changed everything. The next morning, I drove straight to his farm. I didn't call ahead. I didn't give him time to prepare. I wanted answers. The old farmhouse sat exactly where it always had, surrounded by fields that stretched toward the horizon. When I pulled into the driveway, Richard was repairing a fence. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked at me, then at the truck, then back at me again, almost like he'd known this conversation was coming for years. I climbed out and walked toward him. Without saying a word, I handed him the photograph. The one with Maggie and Thomas. The moment he saw it, the color drained from his face. Not fear, not panic. Heartbreak. The kind of heartbreak a person carries for so long, it becomes part of who they are. For several seconds, he simply stared at the picture. Then he handed it back. "You found it." It wasn't a question. It was a realization. I nodded. "And I found Thomas's journal." Richard closed his eyes. Slowly, like a man reliving memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. When he finally looked at me again, he seemed older somehow, more tired. "Who was Thomas?" I asked. Richard stared toward the fields. A faint smile appeared on his face, the kind of smile people wear when remembering someone they loved. "He wasn't just your grandmother's friend." He paused. "He was the love of her life." The words hit me harder than I expected. Love of her life. Not boyfriend, not fiancé. Love of her life. Suddenly the photograph made sense. The way Maggie looked at him, the way he looked at her, the happiness frozen in that moment. Nobody had ever told me this part of Grandma's story. Not my mother, not Richard. Nobody. "What happened to him?" I asked quietly. Richard looked down at the dirt beneath his boots. For several moments he didn't answer. Then he sighed. "Thomas found something he wasn't supposed to find." There it was again. The same sentence, the same mystery, the same secret. But this time, Richard finally continued. Back in 1970, several wealthy businessmen and local officials had been quietly stealing land from working families. Most people never realized it. Signatures were forged, records disappeared, property boundaries were altered. By the time families discovered what happened, it was too late. The land was gone. Thomas accidentally uncovered evidence proving everything. At first, he thought the truth would be enough. He believed if people saw the evidence, justice would follow. But he underestimated the people involved. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous things became. Threats started arriving, anonymous phone calls, people following him, people watching him. And eventually Thomas realized something terrifying. The evidence wasn't only putting him at risk, it was putting Maggie at risk too. Richard sat heavily on a wooden crate nearby. For the first time I noticed his hands shaking, not from age, from memory. "He was scared, Ethan." Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. "Not for himself." He swallowed hard. "For Maggie." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Wind moved across the fields. A distant tractor hummed somewhere beyond the property. Then Richard stood and walked toward an old garage. When he returned, he was carrying a weathered cardboard box. The edges were worn. The tape had yellowed with age. Carefully, he placed it on the workbench. "I've been keeping this for almost 40 years. My pulse quickened. "What is it?" Richard looked at the box, then back at me. "Your grandmother told me never to open it." He paused. "But she also told me one day you'd come looking for answers." I slowly lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes, neatly stacked, carefully preserved. Every single one addressed to Maggie. Every single one signed by Thomas. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I picked up the first envelope, then the second, then the third. Something immediately stood out. There were no stamps, no postal markings, no mailing addresses. These letters had never gone through the mail. Thomas delivered them himself. I opened the earliest one. The date stopped me cold. November 1970. My eyes widened. Thomas's journal ended in October. Everyone believed he disappeared in October, yet here was a letter written a month later. I grabbed another. December 1970. Then another. January 1971. My heart started racing. Thomas hadn't vanished, at least not when everyone thought he had. For months afterward, he was still alive, still writing, still communicating with Maggie. Everything I thought I knew suddenly fell apart. Then I found one final envelope. Unlike the others, it carried a message across the front. To be opened only if I never return. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Slowly, I unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting matched the journal. The first sentence hit me like a freight train. Maggie, if you're reading this, then my time has finally run out. I kept reading, every word pulling me deeper into the truth. Thomas explained everything. The land fraud, the stolen property, the powerful people involved, the evidence he had gathered, the danger surrounding them. Then came the sentence that changed the entire mystery. The people searching for me never discovered where I hid the evidence. I stopped breathing. My eyes moved to the next line. If they ever find it, they'll come looking for the cabin. Then the final line. The line that explained 40 years of secrecy. The line that explained every board, every nail, every evening Maggie spent checking those windows. The windows are the key. Silence filled the room. Richard looked at me. I looked at him. And for the first time, I understood something important. Grandma wasn't hiding from the truth. She was protecting it. For nearly 40 years. The evidence had never been buried in the woods, never hidden in town, never locked inside a bank. It had been inside that cabin the entire time, waiting, hidden behind the very thing everyone ignored. The windows. And suddenly, I knew exactly where I needed to go next. The strangest thing about family secrets isn't the lie itself. It's how long people are willing to carry the weight of it. Years pass, people grow older, entire generations come and go, yet one promise can survive longer than the people who made it. And hidden behind the final unopened window in Grandma Maggie's cabin was a promise that had survived nearly 40 years. A promise I was finally about to uncover. I drove back to the cabin before sunset. The entire trip, Thomas's words echoed in my mind. The windows are the key. For days, I'd been chasing the wrong mystery. Everyone wanted to know what happened to Thomas Miller, but now I realized the real question was different. What had Maggie spent 40 years protecting? And why had she protected it until the day she died? The answer was waiting inside her bedroom, the only room in the cabin where one window remained completely untouched. The same room she'd slept in for decades, the same room she'd guarded every single night. My hands were shaking as I carried the hammer inside. For a moment, I simply stood there, looking at the boards, looking at the rusted nails, thinking about Grandma, thinking about Thomas, thinking about the promise that connected them across nearly 4 decades. Then I pulled the first nail, the second, the third. One by one, the old boards came loose. Dust drifted through the fading sunlight. Finally, the last board dropped to the floor. For the first time in decades, sunlight touched the entire frame. At first, I saw nothing, just old wood, old paint, years of dust. Then I noticed something unusual. One section of the frame was slightly thicker than the rest, not enough for anyone to notice casually, just enough to hide something important. My pulse started racing. I grabbed a screwdriver and carefully pried at the edge. The wood shifted. A hidden compartment. My heart nearly stopped. Inside were bundles of documents wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture, protected from time, protected by one woman for almost 40 years. Thomas's evidence. Every forged deed, every altered property record, every fraudulent land transfer, everything he had risked his life to collect. For several minutes, I simply sat there staring. Thomas had been telling the truth all along, and Grandma Maggie had spent nearly half her life protecting his final mission. Suddenly, every piece of the puzzle fell into place. The windows, the secrecy, the warnings, the fear. None of it had been about protecting herself. It had always been about protecting the truth. But one question still remained, the question that had started everything. What happened to Thomas Miller? As I sorted through the documents, a small envelope slipped free from the bundle. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to Maggie. Across the front were 5 handwritten words. For whoever finds the truth. A chill moved through me. Slowly, I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter, and before I reached the bottom of the first page, my eyes filled with tears. Because for the first time, Thomas told the entire story. He hadn't been murdered. He hadn't been kidnapped. And Richard hadn't betrayed him. In fact, Richard had sacrificed more than anyone knew. When Thomas realized how dangerous the situation had become, he made a decision. A painful one. The evidence had to survive. Maggie had to survive. And if that meant disappearing from the life he loved, then that's what he would do. With Richard's help, Thomas quietly left Wisconsin under a new identity. Only 3 people ever knew the truth: Thomas, Maggie, and Richard. The plan was simple: leave, stay hidden, wait until it was safe, then come home. Again and again, Thomas wrote the same promise in his letters. Just a little longer. When this is over, I'll come back to you. I promise. For years, Maggie believed him, because she knew the man making those promises. Thomas wasn't the kind of person who walked away from the people he loved. Every letter carried hope. Every letter carried another promise. Every letter carried another reason to keep waiting. Then, in 1984, everything changed. According to the final documents, Thomas was driving through Colorado during a winter storm. A truck lost control on an icy mountain highway. The collision happened without warning. Thomas survived the crash, but suffered severe injuries. He was rushed to a hospital hundreds of miles from anyone who knew his real identity. For 3 days, doctors fought to save him, and for 3 days, Thomas asked the same question. Had anyone contacted Maggie? The answer was always no. On the 4th morning, Thomas Miller passed away. Alone. Still carrying her photograph in his wallet. Still believing he would somehow find a way home. I lowered the letter, and for several moments I couldn't breathe, because suddenly I understood something that broke my heart. Grandma never stopped waiting. Not because she didn't know what happened. Richard eventually told her the truth. But because love doesn't simply disappear when a story ends. Part of her kept hoping, kept remembering, kept looking toward a future that would never come. And suddenly the cabin made sense. It wasn't a prison. It wasn't a hiding place. It wasn't a monument to fear. It was a promise. Every boarded window, every hidden document, every secret she carried. It was her way of honoring the man she loved, the man who gave up everything to protect her. Several months later, the evidence was turned over to state investigators. The case reopened. Families finally recovered land that had been stolen decades earlier. Records were corrected. Names were cleared. And for the first time in over 40 years, Thomas Miller's sacrifice was finally recognized. His story was no longer hidden. As for me, I kept the cabin. I still own it today. The windows are open now. Sunlight fills every room. The darkness is gone. But one thing never changed. Above the fireplace sits a framed photograph, a young woman named Maggie, standing beside a young man named Thomas, both smiling, both unaware of the years that waited ahead. And every time I look at that photograph, I think about something Grandma once told me when I was a kid. The strongest people aren't the ones who hold on to anger, Ethan. They're the ones who hold on to love. Back then, I didn't understand what she meant. Now, I do. Because some people leave behind money, some leave behind property, and some leave behind a story so powerful, it keeps speaking long after they're gone. As we get older, we begin to understand something simple. A house is never just wood and nails. A photograph is never just paper. And a family secret is never only about the past. Because behind every old door, every forgotten letter, and every fading memory, there's a human story waiting to be remembered. If tonight's story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you enjoy slow burn mysteries, family secrets, forgotten histories, and stories that stay with you long after they end, subscribe and join us for the next journey. Until next time, take care of the people you love. Listen to the stories they tell. And remember, every family has a history. Every home has a memory. And sometimes, the truth waits a lifetime to be found.